Good morning from the West Coast. My name is Kristen Brock, and I'm thrilled to be with you here today. So we only have about 25 minutes, so I am going to try some new technology. We'll see how this goes, but let's dive right in. Thank you so much for joining me. I truly wish we could be together in person, but that is just now not how it's going right now. So we will do with what we've got. Our time is short and you will have the slides, but I want to go ahead and get going and start talking about childhood trauma and resilience. I want to open with my why. And I think it's really important to understand why this topic is so important. These are my three boys. Sam in the middle is a senior at the University of Oregon. Jonathan on the left is a junior in high school, and Deshaun on the right is a freshman in high school. And the two younger boys I adopted through the foster system. They are full bio brothers, and they came into my home when they were both 9 years old. They came at separate times for different reasons. But before I brought these boys in, I truly thought this was going to be easy. I have a master's in marriage and family counseling. I worked in group homes and shelters and lockdowns, and I'd seen every type of behavior possible, been called every name. Thought I truly understood kids from a traumatic background. But I quickly learned that I did not have the tools, that raising them was going to be significantly different than it was raising Sam. And I started doing some work on childhood trauma and resilience. So this is my why. My three boys are my why for why I do this work. So we're going to spend our time, typically I have a whole day of this for training. So I'm going to just briefly highlight the really big pictures, talk about the ACEs study, the 6 main discoveries from that study. I want to talk about resilience and 6 strategies to build resilience, a little bit about trauma-informed care, and then I really want to wrap it up and talk about the church and mental health. So let's start with the ACEs study. The ACEs study was a groundbreaking study in the mid-90s between the CDC and Kaiser. And it was a public health study that discovered that childhood trauma leads to adult onset of depression, disease, all kinds of different things. And it was the first epidemiological study done on trauma. It took 10 years to do the study, so they had some longitudinal work. And it looked, like I said, it looked at these effects over a lifetime of a person. So what did it measure? It measured 10 different experiences that a child might have between the ages of 0 and 18. And they fell into these 3 big categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So before we go into the results, I want to talk for a minute about what was missing in this study. So the first thing that was missing was the ability to calculate any stressors outside of the household. So violence, poverty, racism, any other discrimination. It also didn't take into account any protective factors. So was there a grandmother, an abuela, someone in a child's life that would buffer those stressors? And it didn't take into account individual differences. So we now know that some kids with really low ACEs have poor outcomes, and some kids with high ACEs do remarkably well. It's just an indicator of greater risk. I do want to frame the results, though, of this study. So this study was done with 70% of the participants being white, 70% of them being college educated. So most of them were upper and middle class. They all had jobs and they all had health care. So that's a group that we kind of look like as, boy, that group has it made. So when you think about adding some extra layers on that and the learning and the implications for people of color, people who are unemployed, people who are immigrants, people who have no access to health care, we know now that race matters. We know that women and people of different races and ethnicities, the outcomes are not equal. So that's something that's really important to know. The data that we're going to talk about today is just from this original study. So the 6 main discoveries, each ACE counts as 1 point. You get a score from 0 to 10. And no matter how many times you may have seen your father hit your mother, that still only counts as 1 ACE. So we know that ACEs are really common. Nearly 2/3 of adults have at least one ACE, and 1 in 8 has 4 or more from this study. They cause adult onset of chronic disease, so cancer, heart disease, mental illness, violence. They do not occur alone. So if you have one, there's an 87% chance that you're going to have one or more. The more you have, there's a direct correlation to the poorer your outcomes are typically. They are responsible for a big chunk of workplace absenteeism and all kinds of things that cost us in the long runs. They're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars of costs due to toxic stress in a child's life. And on a population level, it doesn't matter which 4 ACEs you have. The body sees toxic stress all the same, so it's all going to have the same impact. So the outcomes fell into certain types of behaviors. There were 5 different behaviors, and there were 10 different physical and mental health possible outcomes. And the one I'm hiding down here on the right is broken bones. Some other high-level findings that they found, 1 in 6 men experienced emotional trauma. And you start looking at, when we look at costs, 80% of people in psychiatric hospitals have experienced physical or sexual abuse. 66% of people in substance abuse treatment reported childhood abuse or neglect. And 90% of women who are alcoholics or who suffer with alcoholism were sexually abused or suffered severe violence from their parents. I just want to leave this data on the screen right now. We know suicide is an epidemic, particularly with our children and our teens. If you look at 80% of child and adolescent suicide attempts are all attributed to adverse childhood experiences. It's a pretty powerful number. So you can think of an ACEs score as a cholesterol score for childhood trauma. And I'm not going to spend time highlighting all of the different things on these data sheets, but I do want to highlight that people with an ACEs score of 6 or higher are at risk of their lifespan being shortened by 20 years. So just that alone is such a critical indicator of what toxic stress does to a child as they move into adulthood. So by now you've probably are calculating your personal ACE score in your head. And one of the things I like to do if we were spending a whole day together is let everybody take the time to do that, recognizing that this can be really traumatic for people, that it can bring up all kinds of things. But understanding our own trauma also means that we recognize how we behave, how certain things can trigger us. And if we work in human services or in social services, oftentimes the emotional toll that it takes on our own bodies is pretty significant. I do want you to remember, even if your ACE score is really high, they don't tally all the positive experiences you've had in life. People with high ACE scores can do remarkably well. Science is now telling us that. And the resilience builds through life. I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about trauma and the brain and how trauma affects the brain, because I think it's really important as we look at, as we move forward. So there are 3 parts of the brain, and I like to use a hand model. If you look at your wrist as the brainstem, which is the survival part of our brain, and then your thumb as the amygdala, which is kind of the trigger alarm, and the 4 fingers wrapping around the amygdala as the prefrontal cortex. It's a really great way to just kind of visually see how our brains are intended to work. So if our brains are working as God intended them, you have a need, and that need is met. So as a child, you are hungry, someone feeds you, your diaper is wet, someone changes you, someone is coming when you cry. And our brains learn that that alarm is going to be taken care of. The brain actually holds that information. It remembers that when an alarm goes off, I'm going to be taken care of. So there are 2 types of trauma that affect the brain. And the first type is acute trauma. So that is a fire, a car accident, depending on what part of the country you live in, a tornado, an earthquake. And the brain goes into action. So that alarm goes off. the rational thinking goes away and survival kicks in. And I like to use an example of if you have a child that's a hard sleeper and normally it's really tough to wake them up. If there's a fire in your house, you're not going to gently wake them up. You're going to grab them, pull them out of the house. It doesn't matter whether they have shoes on. Survival has kicked in. All the rationality about how you're going to parent goes away. So our brains are practiced in this. It's going to quickly function again, and the rational brain will work again, but it holds the information from that trauma. A good example is if you have been in a car accident, if you pass that intersection again, that little amygdala may trigger, but you know everything's going to be okay, and the reasoning takes over fairly quickly. So what happens when this happens every single day in a child's life? This is what chronic trauma is. You're hungry, no one feeds you. Your diaper's wet, no one changes you. No one comes to get you when you cry. The brain begins to malfunction. So the same system is happening, but that little alarm never gets turned off. And it's like hitting a light switch over and over and over the wrong way. And eventually that light switch is going to break. The alarm has to quiet itself. And over time, that intended system does not work anymore. So what's the difference in our brain? When chronic trauma happens, that brain is flipped over and over and over until it's really quickly triggered. So now a child is older, their needs are being met, but it's 15 minutes before lunchtime. So a child who has all their needs met says, I can wait 15 minutes. I'll just go do something else. A child who has had food insecurity is going to trigger, the brain is going to trigger in a different way. So that trigger now means something completely different. The child goes into survival mode, and what that might look like is hoarding food, stealing food. It might turn into anger because the brain has no experience that it is going to be taken care of. We know that toxic stress changes the brain from everything from impulse control, executive function. So you think about executive function in school, what that's doing to young kids. So what does a trauma response look like? It's a common response to a perceived threat. It's often misunderstood as non-compliance, and this is really important for kids. I think when we look at our school system, children are so often diagnosed with ADHD when it's actually childhood trauma, and the treatments for those are completely different. It can lead to negative or punitive reactions for people struggling with just trying to get control over their bodies. And we could spend a whole day talking about the school to prison pipeline when we really need to be dealing with trauma. And trauma survivors are going to respond to the present through the lens of their past most often. So all hope is not lost. When we've spent a whole day talking about some of these outcomes, it's important to know that a lot of things are being done on strength-based learning right now. California has something called the ACEs Connection, and they just changed their name to PACEs Connection because they wanted to address that there are positive outcomes as well on this. We know that a childhood with toxic stress does not automatically mean a bad outcome. And we're starting to look at the whole person, whole family, whole community construct of health and well-being. So let's talk about resilience. I think it's really critical to know that one caring adult can make the difference in a child's life. And what it really does is it buffers those toxic stress experiences rather than cement them into a child's life. If we were together, I would show you one of two movies. Paper Tigers is a fantastic documentary on a school with at-risk kids where they use a trauma-informed approach rather than the typical punitive model for kids who are struggling in school. The second movie, Resilience, is done by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is the pioneer of this work and the ACEs study. I had the pleasure of meeting her when she worked in Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, which is a poor, underserved community, and really changed the way they were doing healthcare in that part. She's now the first Surgeon General of California. But the second movie spends a lot of time talking about some of the factors. So the strategies from that movie are, the first one I want to talk about mostly is it's really changing the discussion from what's wrong with you to what happened. And not so much the discussion, but how we look at people rather than looking at what is wrong, what happened to you, what is causing these types of behaviors or this type of reaction. We do know that toxic stress is the largest public health crisis of our generation. I talked briefly about that. Building critical collaboration. So right now we still have physical health in one place, mental health in one place, and I would say spiritual health in another. And we've got to, the body doesn't recognize things in those different pockets. We've got to figure out how to work those all together in healing. Safe, stable, and nurturing environments. One person can make the difference in a child's life. Preventing intergenerational transmission. I want to share a quick story. There's a woman in one of the trailers, and she did some work on her own ACEs, and she recognized that some of the choices she was making were changing the outcomes for her children. So she had married an alcoholic. She had been divorced twice. And she had the aha that said, I need to make different choices so my children's ACEs scores are not so high. It's just a really powerful moment. And then the final thing around strategies is just really the concept of promoting hope. So why trauma informed? What is it? The two things that are really important are an appreciation for the high prevalence of this traumatic experiences and a really thorough understanding of the effects of trauma and violence on an individual. It's so important, and I'm going to share a story in just a minute, because we can so often unintentionally cause harm to individuals through our practices, through our policies, through our behavior. It's a real possibility that that will happen. It does take everyone to make a difference. Every contact you have with someone either contributes to a safe, trusting, and healing environment, or it detracts from that safe and trusting environment. We want to strive to always do things that help. So I'm going to bring it home for a minute here, and I want to talk a little bit about my boys again. Well, they're great. There was a great article in People magazine in mid-March, I believe. And Michael Orr from the movie The Blind Side was sharing his story of childhood trauma, mental health, and giving back. And it's a great story that gives the real life effects of toxic stress on a kid, even when they get what they need later in life. If you watch the movie The Blind Side, you might think that he moved into this home, he got his needs taken, and everything was just fine. Miraculously, it was all better. But unfortunately, that's not the truth. The truth is that childhood trauma and ACEs have long-lasting repercussions for a kid. And the idea that we can just put them in a better environment and make it all better, erase those generations of trauma, just isn't true. So that story in itself is true, but it didn't magically heal him. I was able to share that story with my youngest, who has had some challenges, and say, look, buddy, what you're going through with the background that you had is really normal. So normalizing that these outcomes and these outcomes are changeable, but they're also behaviors and ways of thinking are really normal. So do I believe in complete and total healing for my boys? Absolutely. Do I pray over them daily? Absolutely. Do I believe that healing can happen miraculously? Absolutely. But I also believe God is going to use their story to glorify him. The reality is that it takes food and clothing and love and shelter and prayer and relationship and therapy to change all of this. So one of the things we talked about was not re-traumatizing. When Deshaun moved back home last March, he had been in a group home, which is another story for a short time, but it literally was the day that California locked down. And he was so excited to be home, go back to youth group. And our church had done a fantastic opportunity or a fantastic move in quickly moving to Zoom youth group. So the first night he got on the screen and they did a scavenger hunt where the kids were running all over the house trying to get things, paper clips, get your mom's driver's license. And one of the things they asked for was a baby photo. And he just looked at me and shrugged because we don't have baby photos. The earliest photo I have of him is about 5 or 6 when he moved into the foster system. The game went on and the last question was 100 bonus points if you can get your dad in the photo. He just looked at me and shrugged again because A, I'm a single parent, and B, his relationship with his dad was pretty traumatic. So unintentionally, inadvertently, it wasn't done from malice, but he was re-traumatized in that. He chose not to go back to youth group for an entire year. He was reminded he was different. And there's so much we cannot control in this world, but I do believe the church has an obligation to serve those with trauma. I do believe that we need to understand mental health issues and to ensure that that the church is a safe place for everyone battling mental health issues and trauma. So what is the church's role in this? And when I talk about the church, I want to talk about the body of believers, not necessarily a building. But the Bible talks about widows and orphans 24 times. It's referenced in scripture. And the first time is in Exodus. I do believe that the Bible is talking literally about widows and orphans, but I also believe it's figurative. Widows and orphans were people that were without cover. God called us directly to minister to care, to meet the needs of the communities, for kids, for families. That have a desperate need for that community. And when we remember that resilience can be built by one person, I think it's so important to know that there can be and there should be a role for the church in that. We also know that parents' well-being is critical to raising healthy children. And so how can we help parents heal and offer what they need to their kids? Our churches are full of parents who have had who haven't experienced positive relationships in their life, and they need that extra support. As a body, can we change that trajectory for intergenerational trauma? So where can you help people in your sphere? I would challenge you that as a church and a body of believers, we really need to look at how we can help people understand trauma. And can we create a body of believers where re-traumatization is the exception and not the norm, where we understand and appreciate the reality of toxic stress on our body of believers? If we had spent the whole day together, I would give you some homework here with some call to action. But I want you to think of what you can do with this information. What are some next steps that you might want to do? And how can we inspire others to stand up and be an ally for children with high ACEs scores and protect their parents at the same time? I know this was fast, and I want to thank you so much for listening. This is all of my contact info. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have questions or comments or anything about this quick presentation. So with that, my brothers and sisters, I want to leave you with my key verse: do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, have a fantastic day. Thank you so much.